desire and the dream to return to Israel is not a product of colonialism or racism or whiteness. It's just literally the dream that we should live at peace in a land of our own. So anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And unfortunately, it's an ideological virus that's infected the entire world at this point.
Well, welcome to the podcast today and to our series, Battle for Truth. Our topic today is the question, is Zionism racism? And as our guest, we have with us Monique Beadle, Director of US Policy and Advocacy from the Jerusalem Institute of Justice. She is a human rights attorney with 19 years of experience in international affairs, asylum and refugee issues, and the rights of victims of human trafficking, torture, and sexual abuse. As a grandchild of Holocaust survivors from Germany, she has spent most of her career advocating for other people in Thailand, Ukraine, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. She recently joined the Jerusalem Institute of Justice, where she has joined her own people in an existential struggle for survival. JIJ is an Israeli human rights organization based in Jerusalem, and for 20 years, they have fought for the rights and well-being of vulnerable people in Israel and the Middle East. Within Israel, JIJ provides free legal aid to survivors of human trafficking, Israeli civilians who have been internally displaced since October 7th, and new immigrants arriving from around the globe. Outside of Israel, JIJ is the only Israeli human rights NGO with United Nations consultative status that is pro-Israel. JIJ's team of advocates in Jerusalem, Geneva, and New York are defending Israel's legitimate standing in the community of nations. Monique is based in the New York area, where she represents JIJ at UN headquarters and on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. Monique, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jeff. It's good to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you with us, and I've been looking forward to meeting you, although virtually in this instance, but it's been great to hear you on some of the webinars and things that we've been listening to since this horrific thing that happened on the 7th of October. But let's get a little background about you. Can you please just tell us a little bit about the experiences that led you to do the work that you're now doing at JIJ?
So my whole life, I've drawn in really intense inspiration from my grandparents. They escaped Hitler's plans for them, and they really devoted their lives to serving others. So my grandfather, Jerry, he established our family law firm, which helped Holocaust survivors recover their stolen assets from Swiss and German banks. Oh, wow. And my great-grandfather, Ernst, he set up his medical practice in Harlem. And that was a place where his African-American patients weren't going to discriminate against him for his German accent. So they created this model for me of building the Jewish community on the one hand and serving the needs of other types of minorities on the other hand. And this was sort of a mode of defiance. So throughout all of the twists and turns of my career in the human rights world, working with, persecuted minorities from around the world, the reality is that the fact that I'm an unapologetic Zionist has always been something of a liability. So I joined JIJ, which has really been at the forefront of effective human rights advocacy in Israel for 20 years now. And I really have come to think of it as a way to reconcile the two sides of myself and to walk in the footsteps of both of my grandfathers and not just one or the other. So I'm really honored I'm actually a pretty new addition to the team, having joined the team on October 7th, and really have been drinking from a fire hose ever since.
No kidding. Well, it is great to have you as a part of the team. We certainly are thrilled that you have come alongside Flavia and Lydia and Uri and all the others that are working there at JIJ. And what a legacy, just to hear that little bit of background of your story. It really must give you a sense of passion and purpose in this work that you're now doing. Thanks so much for sharing that. We're dealing with this question today of, is Zionism racism? And this term is something that I just find completely mind-boggling. This idea that somehow if you're a Zionist, you're a racist. I've been to Israel. None of this adds up for me. So talk to us a little bit about where and why did this kind of idea originate, and what was the motivation behind creating this false claim?
So I think that when people say this, they don't realize that they're actually parroting Soviet propaganda from the 1970s. It was
Mhm.
actually the Soviets who coined this term. So they coined it out of a sense of frustration with basically their failure to undermine the still very nascent and fragile state of Israel. Israel at that point had successfully repelled a coordinated attack of 5 Arab armies that were allied with Russia. That was first in 1967 and then again in 1973. So I want to jog through some of the milestones of the 20th century in order for this to make sense. So
Yeah.
we should remember that Europe spends the better part of the 1930s and 40s purging itself of its Jewish population. And then the Middle East and North Africa, they spend the better part of the 1950s and the 1960s doing exactly the same thing. So many people may not know, but Baghdad in Iraq actually used to be about 30 to 40% Jewish. So
Yeah.
that's an even higher than the current Jewish population of New York. So Baghdad, for all intents and purposes, was a Jewish city. But in 1941, as the Nazis were prosecuting their war of annihilation of the Jews in Europe, there was the Farhud, which was a pogrom against the Jews of Iraq in 1941. And so it had a devastating effect on the Jewish community of Baghdad. So by the time you get to 1951, the Jews of Iraq have been totally driven out through pogroms, discrimination, and threats of violence. And the same thing has happened in Iran, in Yemen, in Morocco, Algeria, Syria, Lebanon. The entire Muslim world becomes Judenrein, which means free of the Jews.
Hmm.
And so the Soviets are gaining influence in the Muslim world because it was yet another front in the Cold War. In the battle between the Soviets and the United States, the war wasn't actually fought. It wasn't a hot war. It was a cold one. And so it was fought through proxy battles in other countries. So part of this proxy battle was the distribution of Arabic translations of the protocols of the Elders of Zion across the Arab world. So the protocols are a fake Russian document that pretends to be written by Jewish leaders, and it explains the so-called Jewish conspiracy to control the world secretly. So this is the
Mm.
political backdrop of the Soviet campaign to delegitimize the young state of Israel. And it really all comes to a head in 1975 when the Soviets orchestrate this resolution in the United Nations General Assembly. And this resolution enshrines the term Zionism is racism. And unfortunately, this resolution wasn't retracted until 1991. So it really succeeded
Wow.
in poisoning the atmosphere for generations. I want to be clear here that not only is Zionism not racism, but anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. What is Zionism fundamentally is the belief that the Jewish people don't have to live forever at the sufferance of others. It's a realization that anywhere we've ever lived outside of the land of our ancestors has not been safe to us.
Hmm.
Every single place we've ever lived has eventually grown tired of us and has purged us. And so, as a result of this, we must have a land of our own if we're going to survive. Zionism also was not invented in the late 1800s by Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl obviously, succeeded in popularizing the concept and drawing support for the idea. But the Zionist dream is the phrase "L'shana ba'a b'Yerushalayim," which we say every single time we celebrate Passover. I mean,
Hmm.
the desire and the dream to return to Israel is not a product of colonialism or racism or whiteness. It's just literally the dream that we should live at peace in a land of our own. So anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And unfortunately, it's an ideological virus that's infected the entire world at this point.
Wow. That was super helpful even for me, because I was not fully aware of all of that background with Russia and the UN resolution in 1975. I'm shocked that it took what 16? No, 26 years to be repealed, to be retracted. But it kind of it kind of reminds me of the way the UN still operates today. Um, wow. Well, this idea, I think of Zionism, and because I've been to Israel, and because I know a lot of Jewish people who support, Israel's right to exist, and a lot of Christian people who do the same, I feel like Zionism is the opposite of racism. Visiting there, it feels to me like it's a very open and welcoming society. There are, people from all walks and stripes of life, and I just don't sense that from any of the people that I know. But anti-Semitism is something that has been around for centuries, but seems to have sort of mutated again over recent decades. I think there was like a short reprieve after the Holocaust, but now, and of course since October 7th, I think the figure I heard the other day was that anti-Semitism has increased over 400% since that time, and it may be even higher. I don't know if I have the most recent figure, but how has this happened? Why has this happened, specifically since this horrific massacre on the 7th of October?
So, anti-Semitism works a bit differently than other forms of hatred. Other forms of hatred are usually driven by an accusation of inferiority. One group finds the other people group inferior in some basic way, and so they find the right kind of dehumanizing rhetoric that highlights that sense of inferiority, and then they can persecute the other group with less guilt and regret. And so this accusation of inferiority is what drives the transatlantic slave trade. It drives the pushing of Native Americans onto reservations. It drives a sense of tolerance of violence against women as just a normal part of every society. This sense of inferiority. But Jew hatred is different because it's typically driven by a sense of undeserved superiority. So how is it that there's so few Jews in the world? And, we've tried our level best to treat them so badly, and yet they've managed to do so many consequential and influential things in the world. How
Mhm.
did that happen? There must be a conspiracy afoot. They must have some secret way to pull the strings behind the scenes, to control the weather, to manufacture controversies. And it's very, very easy to pour gas onto this fire because you just have to take whatever is politically unfashionable at any particular moment, and you can just accuse the Jews of masterminding it. So the
Wow.
communists hated capitalism. So to them, the Jews were the ultimate capitalists. And to the capitalists who hated communists, we are the ultimate communists. The Nazis, they wanted racial purity. So we were the ultimate race contaminators. Think about the guy who shot up the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh. Now, he perpetrated mass murder because in his eyes, Jews were bringing too many immigrants to America in an attempt to replace the white population. So when your enemy is an actual virus like COVID or the Black Plague, then you can blame the Jews for creating or spreading it. And when the enemy is the weather, then you can blame the Jews for controlling it or manipulating it. So now we're in 2023 and there's this new sin in the West, and it's called whiteness. It's racism. It's privilege. And so the Jewish people have been cast as the paragons of white privilege, as oppressors of Black, brown, and indigenous people of color. And the Palestinian nationalist movement has very effectively kind of hooked itself onto this narrative, and it casts the Israeli Jews as white, settler, colonialist oppressors of poor, structurally oppressed brown Palestinians. Now, in order to get at this narrative, you have to ignore some inconvenient facts. You have to ignore that fully half of Israel's Jewish citizens are the descendants of refugees from Iraq, from Morocco, from Ethiopia, from Yemen, not from Europe. And by the way, like people from Europe, their presence in Israel is not any more illegitimate than the presence of Jews from other countries either. I don't want to, play into that
Right.
dynamic. But the other fact this ignores is that the Arabs were the ones who actually invented the chattel slavery of Black Africans long before Europeans ever adopted it. And discrimination against Black Africans is very strong still in Arab society. Even
Mm.
in Gaza, which has a neighborhood called Al Abid, where Afro Palestinians lived. And Al Abid means slaves, it's the neighborhood for the slaves.
Wow.
So discrimination against Blackness and Black people is very strong, continues to be strong in many Arab societies. Another inconvenient fact to this narrative is that the Arabs are not actually indigenous to the Levant, which is where Israel is, but they're indigenous to Saudi Arabia. So they actually colonized the rest of the Middle East and North Africa. They did it through the vehicle of Islam. And Islam was kicked off in the 7th century with a mass genocide of the Jewish communities of Mecca, Medina, and Baghdad. Unfortunately, none of
Wow.
those facts actually fit the white colonizer narrative, so they're discarded.
Mhm.
So that's, I think, the latest mutation. It fits with the new fashionable anti-racist perspective that's popular in the West. I personally actually agree that racism is bad and that all of our Western societies have room to grow, and that we all have work to do to overcome any residual legacies of discrimination. But I don't think that our countries shouldn't exist just because they have room to grow. And so when I look at the state of Israel, I look at it as an imperfect society that, like any democratic society, has room to grow, has issues, needs to constantly be improved.
Mhm.
But the Palestinian nationalist narrative is that it shouldn't exist at all.
Right.
And I feel we have to push back against that, really forcefully. And what's really sad to me about the way that anti-Semitism tends to mutate is that it always misses an opportunity for introspection. There's always an opportunity to look at the Jewish people, to learn from us, from our values, from our sense of community, from the habits that we have, which actually generate our resilience and our ability to pick up wherever we get expelled to and build again. To look at our sacred texts, which we share with our Christian brothers.
Mhm.
So there's really a chance to appreciate that there's this unique and interesting people group in the world who have survived so much and contributed so much, and who really want nothing more than the opportunity to live free and at peace in the land of our ancestors. And is that really such a nefarious thing, to work towards and to hope for?
I don't think so. I don't think so at all. And I think that uh, it's truth that we're trying to sort of get at here, and that we want people to hear. And you're sharing so many important things. You mentioned, the many immigrants, refugees who came from many of the Arab states surrounding Israel. As being part of some of this inconvenient truth, and it's interesting that those those refugees were ethnically cleansed essentially from those countries. Many came from around the world simply by choice, but these people were fleeing for their lives, and it's amazing to me how this concept can sort of get flipped now, and people say, that Zionism is racism and is bad. Just boggles my mind. Um,
If the whole world weren't racist, then there would be no need for Zionism. I mean, that's the truth.
wow.
If the whole world didn't have a problem with Jews and had not proved that it had a problem with Jews across the centuries, then there would be no need. But this is the reality that we live in.
Wow. That is
Another point I think is important is that Jewish people never left Israel. So
right.
Israel is not only populated by Jewish returnees and refugees, but it's also populated by Jews who have had a constant presence in the land of Israel, even
Mhm.
since the Romans initiated the exile in 70 AD. So we've never actually fully left. The vast majority of us left, but we never actually fully left. And so our claims to indigeneity in the land of Israel are not manufactured in any way. They're absolutely legitimate. And you see this. There are families that do count back not just 7 or 10 generations, but they can count back dozens and dozens of generations to living in the land of Israel.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that's also important for people to understand. And the fact that there were there were Jews and Arabs sort of coexisting in what was then called, Palestine. I was trying to explain this to somebody the other day. He kept using this term Palestinian, and I said, well, okay, so Jews who lived in that area pre 1948, carried Palestinian passports. This was their identity because of where they lived, and it's important for people to understand that the Arabs who left, there's a lot of talk about the fact that Israel, or that the Jews drove the Arabs out in sort of 47, 48. But the truth is, the Arab powers that be asked them to leave. They said, "You go, get out of the way while we wipe out these people, and then when it's all done, you can come back." And the big gamble that they lost was that they didn't wipe out those people. Those people actually prevailed and were resilient and have remained. And people need to understand these truths. I think it's just so important that they do. I don't know if you want to
And there
comment
were
on that.
many
I have another
Arabs who,
question.
oh, sure.
Yeah, no, you go ahead and comment on that first, though.
There were many Arabs who stayed, who didn't leave.
Right.
They didn't believe in the rhetoric and the propaganda about the Arab armies being able to destroy, or they had such good relations with their Jewish neighbors that they didn't want to participate in it. And those people are now the free and equal citizens of the state of Israel. And last I heard, the vast majority of graduates of Israeli medical schools are Israeli Arabs. There are Israeli Arab members of the Knesset. There's an Israeli Arab judge in the Israeli Supreme Court who has sent a Jewish prime minister to prison. So the Arabs who stayed were fully enfranchised with equal rights, and are prospering and enjoying a pretty good life in the
Yeah,
land of Israel today. And it's because they chose coexistence over war.
exactly. And that really would sort of solve this problem. But anyway, let's talk about the G word. We hear a lot these days, today especially, about genocide being committed by Israel. So I know you have a response to this, but just kind of answer me the question: is Israel committing any form of genocide in Gaza?
So, speaking as a lawyer, the word genocide has an actual meaning. And it's
Exactly.
actually a far better descriptor for what Hamas did on October 7th
Hmm.
than it relates to anything that Israel's doing in Gaza right now. So, the thing that matters when you talk about genocide as a legal matter is intent. Does one party in a conflict have the intent to destroy in whole or in part another people group? If they do, then it's genocide. If they don't, then it's not. So let's look at Hamas. Hamas published its charter in the 1980s. And in its charter, it makes very clear that its sole purpose is the complete annihilation of the state of Israel and the Jewish people. So I want to encourage anybody who's listening to go look it up and read the original Hamas charter for yourself. And you'll see it's an utterly genocidal document. Now, the state of Israel and its declaration of independence literally extends a hand of friendship to the Arabs, and it seeks to make peace with them. The state of Israel has accepted, like we just mentioned, 2 million Arabs to live as equal citizens in its borders. And historically, the state of Israel has willingly given up its own land for the prospect of peaceful existence. We should remember that Israel gave back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. The
Yeah.
Sinai Peninsula, by the way, had oil, and Israel gave it up for the prospect of peace on its southern border. What's interesting is that Israel tried to return Gaza because before the Six-Day War in 1967, Gaza was Egyptian territory. And as part of the peace deal, which was struck in the 1980s between Israel and Egypt, Israel wanted to return Gaza to Egypt. Egypt didn't want it. They wanted the oil. They didn't want the people of Gaza. And so now we're stuck in this predicament. So we also have to, when we think about genocide, consider the history of Israel's actions. Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005.
Hmm.
It literally removed every last Jewish person. It dug up all of the Jewish graves in Gaza, all for the sake of giving Gaza to the Palestinian people. You want a state? Fine, here's your state. Go for it. Build your paradise on the Mediterranean Sea. Unfortunately, what happened was that the people of Gaza, who had been brainwashed by Hamas's genocidal propaganda for, I think, several decades already at that point, they've actually voted to place Hamas in power in Gaza. Now, they didn't get an overwhelming majority. It was a plurality vote. It was a 43, 44, 46% of the vote went for Hamas. But nevertheless, there was support for Hamas among the population. And so for the last 18 years, under Hamas leadership, the people of Gaza have sacrificed their own lives and their own future in pursuit of this genocidal fantasy that someday they're going to destroy the state of Israel and force 7 million of its Jewish citizens to leave. So that's the fantasy that animated them when thousands of them came spilling over the border to murder, to rape, to dismember, to torture, to kidnap, and also loot. There's a lot of looting. Nobody talks about that. After all the terrorists killed everybody, thousands more civilians came over the border just to loot and take things. So this is the fantasy that they are dreaming about when Hamas leaders go on television and they threaten to repeat October 7th again and again and again. So when we talk about genocide, we have to acknowledge that October 7th was a textbook case of genocide. Israel's military actions in Gaza, on the other hand, are a just and a legal war, which is being fought for the purpose of preventing another genocide like October 7th.
Mm. Okay, so I think that's super helpful. So let's talk about the term war crimes now, because we're also hearing these accusations leveled against Israel. And so what about war crimes? Is Israel committing war crimes in Gaza?
The short answer is no. Long answer is that the accusation is really built on a fundamental misunderstanding of the laws of war. So war in general is a nasty business. The laws of war don't actually serve to make war impossible. They serve to regulate it and to lessen the impact of war on civilians. So the laws of war emphasize several core principles like distinction, proportionality, necessity, precaution. And Israel is actually unique among the nations in its adherence to these principles. So this is why Israel is unique among all the nations that have ever prosecuted a war in dropping millions of leaflets that urge civilians to evacuate from military zones. This is why there's an entire building full of civilian lawyers who weigh in on every possible airstrike. And sometimes those lawyers override the military commanders who are in the field because a proposed strike is going to harm too many civilians. So the laws of war require, in the concept of proportionality, that any proposed attack, you must weigh the expected military advantage against the anticipated harm to civilians. And the expected military advantage cannot be disproportionate to the expected civilian harm. That's what proportionality means. Proportionality doesn't mean that Israel gets to go and rape the same number of Gazan civilians and torture and dismember and kidnap. That's not what proportionality means. Proportionality also doesn't mean that no civilians will die in a war. The laws of war anticipate that, unfortunately, because war is such a nasty business, it is the mechanism through which states vindicate their rights when political processes have failed. And it's nasty. But it understands that there is going to be civilian harm, but it should not be disproportionate. So this is why there's buildings full of lawyers who are advising commanders on these issues. It's also why Israel disciplines its own soldiers when they violate the rules of engagement. I don't want to pretend that Israeli soldiers are always perfect angels and they never go off script. They do. And Israel has a very robust system of military justice to deal with situations like this. This is also why Israel allows so much humanitarian aid to enter Gaza. It's an attempt to provide food and shelter and medicine to the civilians. The problem that we're facing in this war is that Hamas is stealing most of it. Most of the aid going through the Rafah crossing, which is on the Egyptian border, is being stolen by Hamas. In recent weeks, the Kerem Shalom crossing, which is an Israeli border crossing, has been opened. And a good portion of that aid, it turns out, is managing to make its way to some civilians. But it's a thorny question. So I don't want to pretend that in this war that the people of Gaza are not suffering. I mean, they absolutely are. Anybody with a brain who's bothered to go look at the other side has seen the devastation. And
Yeah.
really, the people of Gaza are living through what the people of Mosul went through when the United States flushed out the Islamic State in 2016 and 2017. So in Mosul, the Islamic State had about 4 to 5 years to embed itself inside the civilian infrastructure of the city. Now, it's actually quite similar. There's a lot of similarities between the two conflicts. So Mosul, like Gaza, had about 2 million people. It was pretty densely populated. And also, like Gaza, a good proportion of the civilian population were supportive or sympathetic to the Islamic State.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, they didn't evacuate, or they couldn't evacuate, various reasons. So it actually took the United States and the Iraqi forces about 9 months to defeat the Islamic State in Mosul. And somewhere between 10,000 to 40,000 civilians were killed in the process. And the war there, it did render Mosul basically uninhabitable. If you go and you look at pictures, you can see it's not a place you want to live as a result of the war. But here's my question. Was it necessary? And was it worth it? In my opinion, the answer to both questions is yes, because there was no possible future for the people of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, or Israel. There was no future for the Yazidis, the Kurds, the Maronites, the Jews, as long as the Islamic State had control over a city of 2 million people.
Mm-hmm.
So Gaza is quite a bit more complex than Mosul. You know, in Gaza, Hamas has had 18 years to dig its tunnels, not 4 or 5.
Right.
It's had more time to recruit fighters. It's had more time to turn every single school, a mosque, and hospital into a military asset. And in Gaza, the people have far fewer evacuation options than Moslawis did. And so, you know, Egypt, unfortunately, has closed its gates to the people of Gaza. So they really are hemmed in. And this is exactly why Israel's moving so carefully, especially in southern Gaza, which is where they asked everyone to evacuate to.
Right.
So in every war, there's, you know, tragic mistakes. We've seen that 3 Israeli hostages were accidentally killed by Israeli soldiers. We know that about 30 or so Israeli soldiers have died in Gaza from friendly fire or from equipment accidents. And, you know, if you watch any of the first-person camera footage, you can actually better understand that the urban combat environment is incredibly difficult, and it's absolute hell for anybody who's in the middle of it. So
Yeah.
there's no way around the reality that this war is hell, and I really wish that Hamas would return the hostages unconditionally, and I wish that they surrendered on October 8th, but it's extremely clear they're not going to do that. So
Right.
sadly, the war is going to continue, but it's illegal and it's a terrible war.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing some of those things, because I think it's so important for people to figure this out. You know, the whole idea of proportionality, as you mentioned, a lot of people had sort of lobbed that word at me, and in the beginning, you know, I didn't really know how to respond, but I listened to a very helpful webinar that JIJ sponsored, which really allowed me to understand that it's not numbers. It's not, you know, 50 to 50 in terms of that kind of idea of proportionality, but it has to do with the value of military targets and the assumption that there will be civilian collateral damage. We don't want it, we don't welcome it, but we assume it's going to happen. And especially in this case, when it seems apparent that Hamas is not allowing civilians to leave certain areas and even threatening them with harm, with death, or you know, torture or whatever, that really complicates matters in a lot of ways. And I think that people need to sort of look at all the sides of this and understand. And I loved what you said about intent. You know, what I know of Israel, of the nation of Israel, there's never been any intent on their part to you know, to harm the Palestinian people. Their intent is to defend their own people, and in this case, be able to respond so that future harm might not come to the Jewish people in Israel. So I think this is all very helpful, factual stuff that people need to hear, and hopefully, embrace. You know that we're a Christian organization. We're here in Canada and in the U.S. now, and we're doing what we can to advocate on behalf of Israel, to raise awareness, to bring about people's understanding of the truth. But talking to Christians, many of them, they're struggling. They're wondering about all this. I have friends who have engaged me on social media that are taking me to task for saying the statement, "I stand with Israel." I've got that on my Facebook profile, and good Christian people are saying to me, "How can you possibly say this when And of course they throw the genocide term, the war crimes term. Help us tell Christians that what they need to do. From your perspective, what do you wish that Christians understood better about this tragic time for Israel and Jewish people everywhere? What do you feel is expected from us as Bible believing Christians right now?
So I've had the privilege of meeting many of the Christians who are standing with Israel at some of the rallies and events and marches that I've attended. And I have to say, I always go out of my way to say thank you for being here, because it's one thing for Jewish people to stand up for ourselves. It's another thing for people who don't have the same dog in the fight to stand up with us. And I appreciate that very much.
Mm-hmm.
I want Christians to understand that it's no longer possible to attend a synagogue in North America without an armed guard on duty. Gas the Jews is now a common refrain on elite college campuses. Hitler was right is now scrawled routinely on the walls of dormitories. There is only one solution. Intifada revolution is now blasted on megaphones on campus quads. And the anti-Semitism that we see on display across the globe has never been this brazen, this popular, this widespread, not in our lifetimes. So what we really need from our Christian friends right now is a posture of unconditional love and a boldness to speak up. I think a lot of Christians right now are choosing silence because they feel like these topics are controversial and they don't want to get it wrong. They don't want to get canceled. But this is a moment for unconditional and very public demonstrations of love and support for the Jewish people. And the criticism and the second guessing can come later. There'll be plenty of time for that. But I think you need to understand that we're very deeply grieving and that we are waging a war for survival in our own backyard. And our war is actually not only with Hamas in Gaza, our war is also with Hezbollah in Lebanon, with the Houthis in Yemen, with Iran, which is very close to becoming a nuclear power. There are elements of the Islamic State and pro-Iran militias in Syria who are also attacking us. Really, we're fighting a war for survival on almost 7 different fronts.
Yeah.
And the media doesn't frame it that way, but if you spend 30 minutes in the state of Israel, you'll come to understand that we're living on this tiny little strip of land and we're completely surrounded by enemies who have all committed to wiping us out. So the nations of the world have gathered in the halls of the United Nations to condemn us for having the audacity to exist and defend ourselves from an existential threat. I don't think people understand that the UN General Assembly every single year convenes about 14 or 15 times a year to condemn Israel in a normal year, not a war year, in peacetime. Right. They condemn us over a dozen times every year. How many times per year do they condemn, let's say, North Korea, Venezuela, Syria, Russia? Maybe once per year, sometimes not every single year. Have they ever once, the UN General Assembly has never once condemned any single Palestinian terrorist group? Never once. Still to this day, they can't bring themselves to condemn Hamas, even in the wake of October 7th. So this is what we face in the United Nations. The state of South Africa is currently suing Israel in the International Court of Justice and accusing us of perpetrating genocide. And really, it's a repeat of the, quote, Zionism is racism resolution of the 1970s. And it serves only one purpose. It delegitimizes the Jewish people for daring to exist on this tiny scrap of land where we're surrounded by enemies who are not shy about expressing their own genocidal intentions. Another thing I think Christians need to keep in mind is that the Christian world has only recently been a source of friendship for the Jewish people. For most of Christian
Yep,
history, the church has been a source of persecution instead
that's
of
right.
friendship. And so for me as a Jewish person, I worry that the last 75 years of Christian solidarity, and that's only been partial solidarity, to
That's
be
right.
honest, was maybe just a blip on the screen of history. And we myself and my peers and my friends and people in my community are wondering whether the Christian world, whether it took 6 million of us to die, if the Christian world only gave up anti-Semitism at the foot of a mass grave of 6 million Jews, and if memories are short and everyone's forgotten, then maybe they're just defaulting to the norm, because we certainly see the rest of the world defaulting to the norm. So I think this is a moment where the rubber really meets the road in terms of Jewish Christian relations. We need to know that you have our back. I need to know not just that you would hide me if push came to shove. I need to know that you would get loud with me so that it never gets to the point that you need to hide me.
Right.
I don't want you to be Corrie ten Boom. I want you to be Martin Luther King Jr., who was a proud Zionist with me. So put a mezuzah on your door. Put a Hanukkah menorah in your window. Try wearing a Star of David on your necklace. Go to your local Jewish community events or go to that pro-Israel rally. These things have actually become risky endeavors for Jewish people, even in really nice Western countries and very nice communities. I live in the New York area, and the political temperature in New York City has changed dramatically since October 7th, and it does not feel safe to be visibly Jewish anymore. In New
Wow.
York, which has been a very Jewish city for as long as I remember.
Right.
So understand that if you really want to stand with the Jewish people, you have to be willing to expose yourself to the same level of hostility that we experience on a daily basis, and to help create safety for us by standing with us visibly and proudly. This is the first year in my family's life that we had an active debate amongst ourselves about whether we were going to put a menorah in our front window. We've always done that. And our neighbors have always celebrated as, oh, that's so nice. That's the Jewish family down the street. Isn't that nice? They're celebrating their holiday.
Yeah.
And now suddenly it's become a political act to put a menorah in our windows. And it's become a point of vulnerability. We expose ourselves to hatred. So if you're a Christian, you really love and want to show unconditional love to the Jewish people, try it and walk through the backlash. That's what love really looks like right now.
Wow. Well, Monique, thank you for that incredible challenge. And I think that, all of us, even supporters of Israel like myself, I have cufflinks that I wear that are Stars of David, and my wife has a Star of David that she wears. We're Gentile as they come. And the fact that recently we've actually asked each other the question, like, I don't know, should we wear that to this event? Should we? And we decided, heck yes, we're going to wear it. But even the thought that we would pause and wonder whether or not we should is just so sad to me. And as a Christian, as a believer, I want to say sorry. I want to ask for forgiveness for Christianity and all of the harm that came about to the Jewish people because of Christians. We know that anti-Semitism originates in the early church, in the very earliest days of Constantine and the days that follow. And so we sort of take our part in that, but also want to move forward and say to Christians who are watching, Christians who are listening, you need to do everything that you can to be supportive of the Jewish people in this day and age when a home down the street, just in my neighborhood here. I mean, I live in Barrie, Ontario, an hour north of the city of Toronto, and there's a Reformed Jewish synagogue not too far from here. And there's a family that it's on the way to my granddaughter's preschool. They had a big iron, like welded menorah on their front lawn. And I noticed driving to my daughter's preschool one day before December that they had actually taken it down. And I was so sad. But they must be in so much fear about having that there, that they just wanted to take away that visible reminder to everybody that Jewish people lived in that home. To me, that's the ultimate of just disappointment and sadness. I don't like to see that in my community. I don't like to see it in our world. So I want to challenge people who are watching and who are listening. Understand the truth that's being shared here today. And as a believer in Yeshua, the Jewish Messiah, take your stand for Israel and for the Jewish people, fully acknowledging that Israel is not perfect. Israel as a nation, politically not perfect. However, they have as much right to exist there in the land of Israel as we have to exist here in Canada. Listen, Canada's history with the Native people, America's history with the Native people. There's some angst over some of that brings shame to me, and yet I understand that nations exist with this in their history and with this in their past, and so it's something that we need to sort of embrace here and understand that those who are indigenous to the land of Israel, that is the Jewish people, going back thousands of years before Jesus, have as much a right to exist there as any of us do in any of our countries. And we want to come alongside, be an encouragement, be a support. And I think it's just so important. Many of you out there, Christians, you're on the fence about this, or you're just totally on the other side. I mean, I've heard Christian people, pastors, who are not, I wouldn't say pro Hamas, but sort of pro Palestinian, not understanding that even saying that makes them pro Hamas in this moment, in this hour. And we need to get on the right side of this and understand what our role is as believers in Jesus, in Yeshua, the Jewish Messiah, that we need to be on the right side of this issue. And so just wanted to throw that challenge out there. Monique, what you've shared has been so helpful to us. And let me just ask you this: how can people find out more about the amazing work that JIJ is doing, and what can we do to help?
So definitely visit our website, jij.org. Go ahead and sign up for our email list. You'll get information on our webinars. You can read our articles. You can sign our petitions. Right now, we're really focused on a petition that the United Nations should categorize Hamas as a terrorist organization. The fact that
Yeah.
it doesn't is a travesty. So go on our website and sign that petition. If there's young adults in your life, we have internships. So, consider that as an opportunity for them. We welcome donations and support in any form, but definitely go to our website, jij.org.
Amazing. Well, Monique, thank you so much for taking the time today and for being with us. And I hope this is the first interview of many.
Me too. It was a pleasure to be with you, and appreciate your support as a Christian friend of Israel very, very, very much.